In the year 1900, in the dusty heart of Dodge City, Kansas, a story unfolded that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who dares to tell it. Behind the wooden walls of an old ranch, hidden from the eyes of neighbors and far from the gaze of the law, a man crossed every boundary of morality. A rancher, respected by some and feared by others, made a decision that would mark his family for generations. He took his own daughter as his wife, creating one of the most inbred bloodlines ever recorded in the American Midwest. At first, whispers spread like dry grass catching fire in the wind, rumors that seemed too shocking to be true. But as time went on, more details surfaced, each one darker than the last. Families nearby spoke in hushed tones, ashamed to repeat what they had heard. Children born on that ranch carried the visible scars of a legacy that no one dared confront. Tonight, we're going to uncover every detail of this story, how it began, how it remained hidden for so long, and how it eventually shocked an entire community. Stay with us until the very end, because the truth is more disturbing than any rumor. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, leave a like to support our work, and tell us in the comments from which city you are watching. Dodge City, at the turn of the 20th century, was a town caught between two identities. Once notorious for saloons, gunfights, and the clang of spurs on dusty streets, it was slowly transforming into a quieter ranching hub. But a few miles outside its modest main street, where churches and general stores stood shoulder to shoulder, stretched a different world. Isolated homesteads, weather-beaten barns, and miles of open prairie that swallowed both sound and sight. It was in this forgotten stretch of land that the ranch in question stood, hidden behind creaking fences and worn-out gates, a place few outsiders dared to enter. The house itself was modest in structure but heavy with neglect. Wooden boards, warped from years of harsh summers and bitter Kansas winters, leaned against each other as if barely holding. The roof sagged in places, patched clumsily with tin sheets that rattled with the slightest wind. Inside, the air carried the stale smell of dust and old smoke, as if time itself had refused to move forward. Chickens scratched around the yard, and a few thin cattle lingered near a water trough, their ribs visible even from a distance. When visitors approached, they were often received not with hospitality but with suspicion. The rancher, a man with broad shoulders and eyes that rarely betrayed emotion, greeted strangers curtly, his words few, his tone clipped. Behind him, a young woman, thin and pale, often lingered in the doorway. She seemed neither wife nor child at first glance, her presence confusing to those who did not know the deeper story. Her eyes rarely met anyone's gaze. When they did, they revealed a mixture of fear and resignation that unsettled even the most hardened neighbor. The community around them had grown accustomed to keeping their distance. Most families in the area were poor but held tightly to their sense of decency and reputation. They shared tools, helped mend fences, and gathered at church on Sundays. But the rancher's household was different. No one recalled seeing his supposed wife attend Mass. No children from that home played with others in town, and when questions were asked, the answers were always vague, shifting like sand in the wind. A few neighbors, compelled by curiosity, had visited on occasion, perhaps to trade, perhaps out of concern. What they found only deepened the unease. The young woman introduced hesitantly as the rancher's wife bore an uncanny resemblance to him, her features echoing his in ways that could not be ignored. The silence between them was thick, almost oppressive, and it seemed to speak louder than words. It was in this lonely corner of Dodge City's outskirts that the seeds of suspicion began to grow. At first, it was only an uneasy feeling, a sense that something was out of place. But the ranch itself, with its sagging walls and tense inhabitants, became the stage for one of the darkest family secrets ever whispered in the American Midwest. The first thing outsiders noticed, if they looked closely enough, was the silence. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you expect on a ranch, where the wind carries the sound of cattle or the creak of a barn door. This silence felt heavier, almost suffocating, as though voices were deliberately suppressed. The young woman in the house rarely spoke, and when she did, her words came out barely above a whisper, like someone afraid of being heard. Even among neighbors, her absence from casual gatherings or church socials became a detail impossible to ignore. Visitors who happened to stay longer than a brief exchange often remarked on the woman's appearance. Her complexion was pale, almost sallow, and her body seemed frail, as if she had carried the burden of too much work or too many sorrows for someone so young. Her eyes had the same piercing shade as the ranchers, and their facial similarities struck some as unsettling. But in a time when gossip could ruin lives, few dared to voice what they suspected. Children born within the household only deepened the unease. They were rarely seen in town, and when they were, whispers followed. One boy, perhaps 7 or 8, had features that seemed out of balance, his forehead slightly larger than expected, his teeth growing unevenly, his gait awkward. Another child had a persistent cough that never seemed to leave, no matter the season. Neighbors would notice, exchange glances, and then quickly change the subject. In communities where survival depended on unity, it was easier to pretend not to see than to confront something so disturbing. There were smaller details too, things that might have been dismissed as quirks in any other family. The rancher was fiercely protective, never allowing his wife to linger in conversation with others. He often answered questions meant for her, his hand firm on her shoulder as though guiding the exchange. On the rare occasions she smiled, it carried a nervous edge, like a mask quickly slipping back into fear. The investigator, or perhaps any observant passerby, would also notice the lack of photographs in the home. In an era when families often displayed portraits as tokens of pride, this household had almost nothing on its walls. The absence of records, memories, and even simple decoration hinted at lives meant to be hidden rather than celebrated. It was these subtle signs, frailty, silence, the physical similarities between husband and wife, and the children who bore quiet marks of suffering, that stirred suspicion. None of it was proof, not yet. But in Dodge City, where people prided themselves on morality and tradition, such details began to weave a darker story. Behind those faded wooden walls, something deeply unnatural was being lived as ordinary life. At the dawn of the 20th century, Dodge City was still shedding its reputation as a lawless frontier town. The days of gunfighters and cattle drives had mostly passed, replaced by quieter routines of farming, church gatherings, and the slow build of respectability. Yet for some families, the shadow of the frontier lingered. Life outside the town center was hard, marked by isolation, poverty, and the stubborn independence that came with surviving on the plains. The rancher at the center of this story came from one of those families. His parents had settled in Kansas decades earlier, drawn by the promise of cheap land under the Homestead Act. They carved out a living in the unforgiving soil, far from neighbors, relying only on themselves. That independence became pride and eventually a suspicion of outsiders. The family rarely mingled with others, avoiding town except for supplies. Church attendance was sporadic, and community ties grew weaker with each passing year. By the time the rancher inherited the land, the household was already known for keeping to itself. Records from the county courthouse showed land disputes, unpaid debts, and even a few accusations of violence that never reached trial. Neighbors whispered that the family believed outsiders brought only trouble, and so they chose to keep their bloodline and their secrets tightly bound. In such isolation, social norms, marriage, kinship, morality slowly eroded. Old letters found later in county archives hinted at a troubling dynamic. A schoolteacher once wrote to authorities in the 1880s, concerned that the children on the ranch were withdrawn, unwilling to speak in class, and often absent for weeks at a time. Nothing was done. Another account came from a preacher who traveled through the area in 1895. He described the rancher's household as peculiar and withdrawn, with a sense of unnatural closeness among its members. Again, no action followed. In an era when privacy was sacred and law enforcement stretched thin, suspicions were easy to ignore. Those who lived closest to the ranch recalled the father's stern authority. He ruled with silence more than words, and his children, especially his eldest daughter, were rarely seen apart from him. When his wife died young, the daughter's role in the household shifted. Some neighbors claimed they noticed her wearing her mother's old dresses, standing beside her father in church pews with an unsettling resemblance to a wife rather than a child. Few dared to say more, and those who did were silenced by the fear of retribution. By 1900, Dodge City had moved on from its violent past, but the ranch seemed frozen in time, locked in its own rules. The town was building schools, railroads, and even small theaters, but just a few miles away, an entirely different reality unfolded. The gap between community progress and the family's private decay created a hidden world where taboos flourished unchecked. This was not just the story of one man's choice. It was the result of years of neglect, silence, and a society that often looked the other way. The combination of isolation, pride, and unchecked authority became the perfect ground for a tragedy that would later horrify all who learned the truth. The more time outsiders spent around the ranch, the harder it became to dismiss the growing unease. What once seemed like harmless oddities, an unusually protective father, a reclusive household, children who rarely mixed with others, now appeared as interconnected pieces of something darker. The young woman, called his wife, not only looked strikingly like the rancher, but carried mannerisms that mirrored his in unsettling ways. The resemblance was so strong that visitors often left with the same unspoken thought: they could not possibly be unrelated. One investigator, sent to the area on unrelated business, noted in his records how the ages did not align. The woman said she was barely in her 20s, yet the rancher referred to her as though she had been by his side for decades. A closer look at county documents revealed no marriage license under his name, no official record of union at all. In fact, the girl's birth certificate placed her directly in the rancher's household. On paper, she was his daughter. Whispers began to turn into questions. Neighbors who had once stayed silent recalled moments that now seemed damning. A farmhand who had worked briefly on the ranch said he overheard arguments between father and daughter with the tone of a marriage dispute rather than parental scolding. Another neighbor remembered seeing the girl wearing a wedding ring, one that looked strikingly similar to the rancher's late wife's band. These fragments, once brushed aside, began to build a picture that no one wanted to accept. Even the children themselves carried evidence. Their features bore echoes of both rancher and daughter, an inheritance that spoke volumes without words. Their illnesses, their developmental struggles, their physical deformities, all hinted at something the community was unwilling to confront directly. The bloodline was folding in on itself. Each generation became weaker, and the consequences were written on the children's bodies. The tension in Dodge City grew as more inconsistencies surfaced. Church records noted the girl's baptism under the rancher's name. School rolls showed her listed as his child until she mysteriously disappeared from attendance around her teenage years. From that point on, she appeared only in public as his companion. The missing link between daughter and wife was glaring, yet for years, no one had dared to connect the dots aloud. By the turn of the century, however, the evidence was becoming too heavy to ignore. People began to avoid not only the ranch, but also the family entirely, unwilling to trade or even greet them on the road. The rancher, sensing the suspicion, became even more guarded. He rarely allowed anyone near the house, and when confronted, he responded with silence or aggression. It was clear now. What had begun as rumor had hardened into something resembling truth. And though proof had yet to be undeniable, the weight of shared observation and hidden documents left little room for doubt. The story of a father and his daughter living as man and wife was no longer just a whisper carried by the Kansas wind. It was a shadow darkening the very soul of Dodge City. When questions finally grew louder, they met a wall of silence. The rancher, a man known for his strength and stubbornness, had no patience for curiosity. Those who dared to ask directly about his household were met with glares sharp enough to end any conversation. More than once, he warned neighbors not to meddle in matters that weren't theirs. His words carried weight in a place where land disputes often turned violent and where law enforcement was miles away. The young woman, trapped in her role, showed little sign of protest in public. Whenever her presence was requested, whether at church, a trading post, or a rare community gathering, she stood silently beside the rancher, her eyes fixed downward. To outsiders, it looked like submission. To those who looked closer, it was fear. Each time someone tried to speak with her alone, the rancher appeared suddenly at her side, ensuring that no words were exchanged beyond polite pleasantries. Authorities faced their own challenges. At the time, the county sheriff's office was small, its duties stretched thin across vast miles of farmland. Rumors of incest or forced marriage were difficult to prove, and without a formal complaint, officials were reluctant to act. Social norms of the era placed great emphasis on privacy within the family, and the law often hesitated to cross the threshold of a man's home without undeniable cause. In that silence, the rancher found his protection. Neighbors, too, bore their share of responsibility. Many whispered in kitchens and on front porches, but stopped short of taking action. Fear of retaliation played its part. Few wanted to find themselves in a dispute with a man who controlled so much land and livestock. But there was also a cultural hesitation. In a society that valued self-reliance, accusing a neighbor of something so grotesque felt like a dangerous breach of community trust. Better to stay silent, they reasoned, than risk the wrath of both the man and the scandal. As suspicion deepened, the ranch itself seemed to turn into a fortress. Visitors were no longer welcome. Even peddlers were sent away with curt words or a hand resting on a rifle by the door. Windows were shuttered more often, and the children were kept inside. The rancher, it seemed, was determined to guard his secret with the same intensity he guarded his land. This resistance only fueled the unease. It was as if every barrier he put up, every silence he enforced, shouted louder than any confession. The harder people tried to look closer, the more obvious it became that something was being hidden in plain sight. And yet, without evidence, the truth remained trapped behind those worn wooden walls. The suspense tightened like a rope. Every closed door, every unanswered question, every fearful glance from the woman suggested that inside the ranch lay a secret too dark to stay hidden forever. The town waited, restless and disturbed, sensing that revelation was coming, but uncertain if they were ready to face it. It was not the law that first broke through the wall of silence, but the voices of those who had once been close enough to notice what others pretended not to see. Over time, fragments of testimony began to surface, each detail small on its own, but together they painted a portrait too disturbing to ignore. One of the first came from a former farmhand, a young man who had worked a single season mending fences on the ranch. Years later, he recalled with unease how the rancher introduced the young woman as his wife, but then, one evening by the fire, slipped and referred to her by a childhood nickname. "It didn't sit right with me," the man confessed. The way he said it, it was like a father talking to a daughter, not a husband to his wife. At the time, he brushed it off, but in hindsight, it seemed like confirmation of the rumor everyone feared. A traveling preacher added weight to the suspicions. In his notes, preserved in church records, he described visiting the household and leaving unsettled. He mentioned the uncanny resemblance between the rancher and his wife and noted that their children bore the same doubled traits. "Their faces carried an echo," he wrote, "like mirrors reflecting the same blood over and over." He left Dodge City soon after, but his words remained in the community's memory. Medical evidence also began to surface. A physician from town, called once to treat one of the children for a persistent respiratory illness, noted abnormalities in his report. He described the child as delicate and stunted, with features consistent with hereditary weakness. Though he never wrote the word incest, his implications were clear enough for those who later read the file. Another child was seen briefly by a school nurse who observed developmental delays and physical asymmetry. The nurse shared her concerns quietly with the local teacher, who later repeated them when asked. But perhaps the most damning came from an elderly neighbor, a widow who had lived on her farmstead since before the Civil War. She recalled watching the rancher's daughter grow up, first as a little girl playing in the yard, then, after her mother's death, as a young woman suddenly pushed into a role that did not belong to her. "I saw the change," she whispered years later. "She stopped looking like a child and started looking like someone's wife, but she wasn't anyone's wife, she was his." Together, these accounts formed a pattern too strong to dismiss. The documents, the medical notes, the whispered testimonies, they converged on one truth. For years, behind shuttered windows and under the weight of silence, a father had made his daughter into his partner. And now, as the evidence piled up, the secret could no longer remain hidden. The community, once hesitant to speak, began to murmur openly. The whispers became accusations, and the authorities, reluctant for so long, were finally forced to listen. The story was no longer rumor, it was fact, backed by witnesses, records, and children who bore the scars of their parents' choices. The stage was set for the revelation that would shake Dodge City to its core. The final blow to secrecy did not come from whispers or suspicion. It came from evidence that could not be denied. After years of rumors, testimonies, and quiet unease, the truth emerged in a form that forced even the most reluctant authorities to act. It began with a birth record. When a county clerk, pressed by mounting questions, pulled old ledgers from dusty shelves, the entries told a story no one wanted to read. The young woman listed as the rancher's wife had, years earlier, been registered as his daughter. Same name, same date of birth, same household. There was no error. On paper, she had been his child before she became his partner. When confronted with the record, the rancher did not deny it. Instead, he stood in silence, his face hard as stone. Witnesses later said he looked neither ashamed nor surprised, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Finally, in a low voice, he admitted what many already knew. "She is mine," he said, "and she belongs to me in every way." It was not a confession of love, but of possession, one that left the room in stunned silence. For the townspeople, there was no turning back. The children themselves bore the undeniable marks of his words. Doctors called in to examine them confirmed what neighbors had long whispered. Their conditions were consistent with close blood union. Some had physical deformities, others suffered from chronic illnesses or intellectual delays. The science of genetics was still young in 1900, but even without formal terms, the evidence was clear to any trained eye. The daughter, pale and trembling, was finally asked to speak. Her voice, long silenced, broke through the years of oppression with a simple truth. She admitted she had never chosen her role. From the moment her mother died, her father had claimed her not just as a child, but as a replacement. "I was never his wife," she whispered. "I was his prisoner." The words spread like wildfire. Dodge City, a town that had prided itself on moving past its violent past, was shaken to its core. Newspapers picked up the story, embellishing details, calling it one of the most disturbing scandals of the era. What had once been private shame was now public outrage. The revelation was more than just a family secret exposed. It was a mirror held up to a community that had chosen silence for too long. The rancher's actions were monstrous, but the years of whispered avoidance and willful blindness had allowed the tragedy to take root and flourish. The truth, once undeniable, left no one untouched. The revelation tore through Dodge City like a storm, and soon the case left the whispers of neighbors behind and entered the cold halls of justice. The rancher was arrested on charges of incest, abuse, and unlawful marriage. For the first time, the silence that had shielded him for decades was broken by the firm hands of the law. Shackled and marched through town, he drew stares from people who once crossed the street to avoid his gaze. Now their eyes burned with equal parts anger and shame. The courtroom was packed on the day of his trial. Farmers, shopkeepers, churchgoers, and mothers clutching children filled every bench, their curiosity colliding with outrage. The daughter, frail and trembling, was brought forward to testify. With halting words, she recounted years of captivity, her role forced upon her after her mother's death. "I was never free," she told the court. "I was told my place was beside him, and there was no one to protect me." Her voice, though weak, carried across the silent room like a knife cutting through the air. Medical experts testified about the children, describing their deformities and chronic conditions as the tragic consequence of a bloodline folded upon itself. Clerks presented the birth and marriage records side by side, proving beyond doubt that the rancher's so-called wife was his own child. Neighbors, once hesitant, now stood to share what they had seen: rings, arguments, and the unnatural silence that had haunted the ranch for years. Piece by piece, the case dismantled every shadow of doubt. The jury deliberated little, guilty on all counts. The sentence was harsh by the standards of the time: years of imprisonment, his land seized by the county, and custody of the children transferred to distant relatives and orphanages. Yet for many, it felt like too little too late. The daughter, now branded by scandal, found no easy path forward. The children, burdened with illnesses and the weight of their origins, faced lives shaped by circumstances they never chose. But perhaps the greatest judgment came not from the court, but from the community itself. For years, Dodge City had looked away, choosing silence over confrontation. The scandal forced residents to face their complicity. Church leaders admitted they had dismissed warnings. Teachers recalled reports they never pursued. Neighbors confessed they had seen enough to suspect, but not enough courage to act. The shame was not only the ranchers, it was shared by the society that had let him reign unchecked. National newspapers picked up the story, calling it a monstrous union and a warning against the dangers of isolation. Writers condemned the failure of institutions, pointing to the lack of oversight in rural areas where the law's reach was thin and community silence was thick. What unfolded in Dodge City became more than a local scandal. It became a lesson broadcast across the country. And yet, behind the headlines and legal sentences, the pain remained personal. A daughter who had lost her childhood, children born into suffering, and a town left to reckon with the knowledge that some tragedies are not born of monsters alone, but of silence, neglect, and fear. When the trial ended and the headlines faded, life did not return to normal for those left behind. The ranch stood abandoned, its windows broken, its barns slowly collapsing under the weight of neglect. For years, travelers passing by would glance at the decaying property and whisper of the scandal that had once shocked the region. The land that had been a fortress of secrets became a monument to silence and shame. The daughter, no longer bound to her father, struggled to find her place in a world that had branded her with scandal. She carried the double burden of being both victim and unwilling participant, a role forced upon her by the man who should have been her protector. Some reports suggested she moved away under a different name, trying to build a life where no one knew her past. Others claimed she lived quietly in a neighboring town, working menial jobs, never remarrying, her eyes forever lowered when asked about her history. The children were scattered. Some were taken in by distant relatives, others placed in institutions. Their health remained fragile, many carrying the physical and emotional scars of their origins. A few passed young, succumbing to illnesses their bodies could not fight. Those who survived grew up under the shadow of whispers, often judged for sins they never committed, reminded of a past they had no power to change. For Dodge City, the scandal left a deep wound. The town prided itself on moving past its violent frontier days, yet this case showed that brutality could live behind quiet doors, hidden not by guns but by silence. In the years that followed, conversations about morality, family, and the dangers of isolation grew louder. Churches preached not only about sin, but about the duty of a community to protect its most vulnerable. Teachers were urged to report signs of abuse more persistently, and county officials began to take records and complaints more seriously. Nationally, the case became part of a broader dialogue about rural isolation and the need for stronger oversight in communities where law and tradition often clashed. Though laws were slow to change, the story lingered as a grim reminder of what could happen when society chose not to look too closely. In the end, the tragedy of Dodge City was more than one man's crime. It was a mirror held up to human weakness. It showed how pride, secrecy, and fear can twist into chains as strong as iron, trapping not only individuals but entire generations. It revealed that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are not strangers in the night, but those within our own homes, protected by silence and the refusal of others to act. As we look back, the lesson is clear. Families may carry secrets, but communities carry responsibility. To stay silent in the face of suspicion is to allow suffering to grow. And in Dodge City in 1900, that silence cost a daughter her childhood, children their future, and a town its innocence.